The 39th argument that's made is actually a series of arguments. I hesitate to even address this one because the title I find offensive, and I don't like to even read the title. Christians, as you may well know, embrace the essence of the Ten Commandments that we find in the Old Testament, which includes the commandment not to take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Which I take to mean, among other things, I take to mean that we're to treat holy things in respectful and holy ways. Regardless of what an atheist might think, obviously an atheist doesn't believe in these things, but as a Christian, I take holy things and treat them in a holy way. And so when I look at the title of this particular argument, which is Realize that Jesus was a Jerk, I find that offensive, and I hesitate to even say it or to offer it. But because this argument is a rather complex one, and it's made up of no less than 11 individual arguments that are made to try to show that Jesus fits the definition of a jerk, which he offers as the following. He says a jerk is a foolish, rude, or contemptible person. And so the argument is a serious one here, that when we look at the Gospels, Jesus comes across as foolish, rude, and contemptible. As I read through these arguments, and I'm going to rush through them, or as many of them as I can get through in the time constraints here, but as I read through these particular arguments, I find it both sad and frustrating because as I read through these things, knowing something of the background of these texts and having thought about them and studied them my whole life, essentially, I'm disappointed and I'm saddened that someone would read the teachings of Jesus and come away with that kind of impression. But it reminds me of people, and perhaps we can all relate to this. If there's someone out there that you don't particularly like, you might find that even the good characteristics of that person, you look at them negatively. Like the person who, that you don't even like their smile, or you don't like the way they walk, or when they do something good, you find fault with it because you just don't like them. That's what comes across to me here in these particular observations. I'm going to offer very quickly responses to these, although the constraints of time don't allow for full elaboration on any one of these. But let me give it a try. The first argument is that Jesus says to love your enemies, but then he goes on to threaten people with condemnation. And he cites in particular Mark chapter 16, where Jesus tells his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. And so he says, what does this mean? That he tells us to love our enemies, but then he says that people who don't believe in him will be condemned. And I would say in response to this, that, a lot of things should be said in response to this. One of them is simply this, that love for a person does not prohibit telling them the truth. Often a parent, for example, has to be very sharp and perhaps even punish very sharply his or her children. That doesn't mean you don't love them. Jesus may speak very sharply to people about their spiritual condition, but that doesn't mean he doesn't love them. If love means just accepting people without telling them what they need to do in order to be the best that they can be, or to be right with God, or to be right with others, that's not really love. Love can be sharp. Love can be confrontational even. And love can tell a person, look, you keep doing that, this is where you're going to go. If you persist in rejecting God's love, then there are consequences to that. If you persist in prideful, arrogant, selfish ways of life, then there are certain consequences of that. And what I find in Jesus' teachings is persistent love. Even when he's dying on the cross, even those who had nailed him to the cross, he says to them, or prays about them and says, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. Contemplating that moment in the life of Jesus, I think, speaks volumes about his genuine love for people, even when they do the wrong thing. And there are lots of other stories to be told. So I think this is an imbalanced and an inaccurate portrayal of Jesus to say that because he teaches love even for your enemies, therefore he can't speak in sharp terms about hypocrisy or self-righteousness or whatever, and speak in condemning terms of those kinds of behaviors. The second argument is that Jesus breaks his promises, and this one again takes us back to the issue of prayer that we've addressed on numerous occasions before in this series of presentations. Jesus says he'll answer prayers, but he doesn't oftentimes answer those prayers. And of course my response is I believe that Jesus teaches us in those various texts, if we look at them carefully, he teaches us that the calling of the human person is not to treat God as a Santa Claus in the sky who just is sitting there waiting to answer our silly prayers, whatever they might be, or serious ones, whatever the case may be. But instead, the purpose of this life is that we grow in virtue, that we become more like Christ, that we become more like what God wants us to be, that we become people of love, of patience, of goodness, of courage, and so on. That if those virtues are being generated in us, then that indeed is what God wants of me. And if my will is conformed to God's, then my prayer will be that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so Jesus' teachings, I don't think, are a blanket statement that all prayer, silly or otherwise, will always be answered, but instead they're a call to seek after God's will and to conform our hearts to God's. The third argument that's used is really a kind of silly argument, and I hesitate to even look at it because it really doesn't have a bearing on the question in front of us. It's a story. He focuses on a story about Jesus who the Gospels tell us, especially Matthew and Luke, they describe several temptations of Jesus when he's in the desert for 40 days after his baptism, being tempted by the devil, we're told, or by Satan. And one of those temptations says that Jesus is taken up to a high mountain, and there he is shown all the kingdoms of the world. And Satan says, if you bow down to me, I'll give you all of these kingdoms. And so the argument is there is no high mountain that allows you to see all the kingdoms of the world. Therefore, this story is just simply bogus or false or whatever. That isn't really related to the topic at hand, but I will say a word or two about it. First of all, he leaves out certain possibilities here in interpreting this. First of all, there's the possibility that there is when he goes up to the high mountain, there's an infusion of awareness, sort of miraculous infusion of awareness of all the kingdoms of the world. Because of his high vantage point, he's able to sort of be confronted with the reality of the world kingdoms, and that's when the temptation occurs. It doesn't mean that he sort of literally from that point on the mountain sees all the way across the world. It can refer to a kind of miraculous vision or sight of this. Another possibility, and this numerous commentators on this text take this particular approach, that the word world here, as it is frequently used in the Gospels, can refer to a more narrow scope of things. It could refer to the world of the Jews, their world, the world in which they lived, in which there was a fragmented kingdom overruled by the Romans that was divided into many parts. And there are a number of mountains within the Holy Land on which a person could stand and look over and see the various primary kingdoms into which the former kingdom of Israel had been divided. And so it's quite possible that in this text it's referring to a high mountain from which Jesus could see into the fragmented kingdoms of Israel, and that the world that Jesus is being challenged to look at is the world of the first century Jews and their messianic hopes, their hopes for a united kingdom and eventually a worldwide kingdom. But in any case, there's nothing here that really is relevant to the topic at hand. The fourth argument that's used is that Jesus sends his disciples into Jerusalem to borrow a donkey, saying that he will return it. But the Bible never tells us that they actually did return the donkey. In other words, the argument is that just like, let's say, a neighbor borrows something from their neighbor and never returns it, so it is Jesus goes, has his disciples borrow a donkey from somebody in the city, and then never returns it to them. Well, first of all, I don't know how you can prove that they never returned the donkey. In fact, I have every confidence that they did, but the Bible doesn't say anything one way or the other. Just as the Bible doesn't give us a whole lot of other tidbits of information that might be marginally interesting. In fact, I suspect that most people, it never occurred to them to ask what happened to the donkey after Jesus rode on it. My full expectation is the donkey was taken back to its owner. Secondly, I think the assumption of the argument is that Jesus' disciples didn't know this person with the donkey. It seems to me that these kinds of stories in the Gospels, like the person with the donkey, or the person preparing the room in which Jesus would celebrate the Last Supper with his disciples, may in fact have been set up meetings with people in the community or in the city that Jesus knew and had contact with, and they had arranged meetings for these things. But in any case, there's no reason to read it in this rather strange way that is suggested here. The fifth argument is used that Jesus steals a herd of pigs and kills them. Now, this, of course, is taken from the story of Jesus casting the demons out of the man, and then those demons are sent into a herd of pigs who then run off into the water and drown. First of all, I don't know how you could call this stealing them and killing them. You could say that Jesus, by sending the demons into the pigs, which perhaps is a wild herd of pigs or whatever there. But in any case, the action or the responsibility for the action is the influence of demonic power on the pigs in the story. Jesus is simply allowing the demons to move on to some other dwelling place rather than the human person. And it seems to me that the background to this is the Jewish understanding of swine or pigs as being unclean animals, and the demons are being sent out of the human person, who is to be treated as good and as holy, and the pigs representing profound evil or something that's unclean, and that the demons were required to leave the man and to go on to something else that would be more fitting for the kind of being that they are, something that was considered unclean. But in any case, I don't think that the story shows us Jesus killing pigs, or that he's stealing the pigs. There are too many other factors that are not known in the story that I think normally people assume that would put it in a very different light. The sixth argument that's used is that Jesus teaches us to amputate limbs of our body, but he doesn't seem to understand the causes of various problems with the body. He has in mind here the text where Jesus says, if your right hand offends you, cut it off, or if your right eye offends you, pluck it out. It's better to enter into life maimed than to enter into hellfire with all the members of your body. First of all, I think it's unfortunate reading of these texts to take them in this ultra-literal way. Christians have never read them. I say never. There have been a few exceptions to that historically, but Christians have never read this as some type of literal statement of having to saw off your arms or pull out your eyes or whatever. Jesus frequently, as was common in the Semitic Middle East, he commonly used hyperbolic expressions to get people to think clearly about something. The point of this particular text is the importance of eternal life, the importance of preparing ourselves to meet God, the importance of dealing with the moral life, and that the body is only relatively valuable and significant. That, in other words, we shouldn't make the body more important than the spiritual life. And so he uses this graphic image to make that point. But no Christian, almost without exception, again, there have been one or two exceptions to this, but the exception, I think, proves the rule, that the vast majority of Christians have had no problem with these texts, seeing them as hyperbolic statements about the importance of focusing on the spiritual life, and rather than valuing the comfort of the body. The seventh argument is that Jesus, we're told in the Gospels, goes into the temple overchanging or tossing over tables and running people out of the temple. And this is, he says, childish behavior. I wish I had more time to address this one, because the action of Jesus going into the temple and cleansing the temple and running people out of it is actually going to be one of the primary sort of causes of Jesus's execution eventually, his crucifixion. Because it was a highly symbolic act, going into the temple and announcing that the temple had been abandoned because of their wickedness and their forsaking of God, was actually a profoundly prophetic event with a very deep background, with a whole bunch of important implications to it. To say that it's just childish behavior is to miss the whole prophetic background to this, the Old Testament background to this. There's so much more in the text than is being seen or acknowledged here. The eighth argument is similar to it, which is when Jesus is going into Jerusalem and coming out of Jerusalem, he sees a fig tree that has no fruit on it, and he curses the fig tree so that it won't bear fruit anymore. And the argument is made here that this also is childish behavior. He's killing something out of spite because it doesn't give him food when he wants it to. Again, this is a failure to read carefully the text. When he's going into Jerusalem and he curses the fig trees in the Bible and trees in general are often symbols of Israel and of Jerusalem in particular and its religious leadership. Jesus was making a parabolic statement by this action of cursing the fig tree. There are parables in the latter part of the ministry of Jesus that make exactly the same point, that the tree that doesn't bear fruit is eventually going to be cut down because it didn't bear fruit. That's a parabolic story indicating the expectation of God that his people respond to his blessings and the truth that he gives to them. So he misses the parabolic intent of the story, which virtually every commentator, if you look at any book on the gospel where this story is found, it's found in a couple of different of the gospels. If you look at any commentary on these texts, you'll find very clearly that they offer the interpretation that I gave, which is very strongly indicated by the context and this moment in the life of Jesus in which we find it. There are several other arguments, but I'm running short on time. Perhaps in a future presentation I can address the others, but But I think you can see that all of these texts are being read in the worst possible light. And I think if we not only look at these texts, but put them in the broader context of the teachings of Jesus, we will see that there is no inconsistency, and that Jesus, as has consistently been affirmed in the Christian tradition, is a person to be loved, not to be despised, as we see here.